Hello, hi. Welcome to Feedback Episode 7. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to be joined by Nate Wooley and Eric Wubbels for a conversation about Eric's music and, in particular, Alphabeta from 2010 that Eric wrote for Yarnwire. And I would like to remind you that you can always send questions ahead of time to feedback@yarnwire.org or join the live chat on YouTube to submit questions in real time. We'd love to hear from you. So without further ado, thank you, Nate and Eric, for joining us. I'm handing over my microphone to Nate.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me as part of this. I've been a huge fan of Yarnwire for a long time and a huge fan of Eric's for a long time, so this was a very special week and a half for me to be able to listen to this piece and look at the score and kind of nerd out as I sat lonely in my apartment. So that was great. Just a heads up about kind of the structure as I'm thinking of it. I'm kind of interested in how people come to certain decisions in their life, especially how something that is a finite piece of music comes out of larger events in an artist's life, how it's affected from ideas outside of music. And this piece seems really ripe for that kind of conversation. So to that end, I didn't do a deep analysis of alphabeta. So I don't think we're going to talk. I know. Next week I'll have my paper to turn in. But
get it together.
Yeah. But I thought instead it would be interesting to talk about the broad concepts. If you do have questions about harmonic structures and things like that, I think you can drive up to Eric's house and sit on his front porch and talk to him about it. But I'm going to start from a place of kind of getting to know everybody as people, especially Eric, because I'm really interested in where he's coming from, where everybody from Yarnwire is coming from, and then at the end, if we have enough time, kind of talking about where everybody's going. So if you're here, you know who Yarnwire is, I would hope, if you didn't stumble over this. If you did stumble over it, then you should check them out. But for now, I'm going to concentrate on Eric because he is kind of the reason for the season. Eric, my first question, and this is something that I'm fascinated by with composers especially, is at what point did you decide that this is what you wanted to be? I think especially for you who is you're active as a performer, but composition to me seems like your greatest expressive outlet. Was there a moment in your life where you're like, this is it for me? This is what I want to do?
No, I think I have maybe a little bit of an unusual trajectory with that stuff, especially in that creatively there was a real like switching over of the tracks from initially being a writer to later being a composer. But I had started as studying piano from a young age, as a lot of people do when they study an instrument like that. And it was really in college that, after having been in a magnet school program in high school for literary arts, for a number of reasons, that the idea of being creative also with music, rather than just treating it as something, which I definitely was in my training up to that point, as something that's just kind of like you execute instructions. It really wasn't something that was super creative for me, even though I enjoyed that very much. The idea that I could, within that same realm, with sound, with music, where as a listener and as someone playing it, I got all of this really exciting kind of sensory feedback and information and sensation and meaning coming to me. The idea that I could like be involved in structuring that and making that mean certain things, or proposing meanings or context for meaning with sound, that came at that sort of later point. And I think, relevant, it's not relevant to every piece that I make, but certainly to this one today, the idea that that there is some kind of connection, not specifically between language and music, but between ways of thinking about both of them as like ways of transmitting meaning and syntax and structure and things in sound. But yeah, I think that was a bit unusual. And since then, my trajectory, I think, has been to try to integrate more and more, not language and music, but performance and composition. So that those things that initially for me were kind of like compartmentalized into left brain, right brain, or something like that. The goal now is much more a sense of like just wholeness and some kind of unifying approach to reinvesting in piano as my instrument, which now I can do because I finally, for the first time in my adult life, have an instrument to play as of very recently. And studying and trying to be more creative as an improviser, which for me is kind of a synthesis of those two approaches as well.
And I have kind of planned to talk a little bit about linguistics, especially about this piece, and improvisation. There are two things that jumped out to me that I think we're going to get to. But I'm kind of interested in, and I think this can be a question actually for everybody because it applies to everybody on some scale. But when you're talking about coming up through literature or being a writer, that's a very specific practice. I mean, I know that for my own work, for my day job, that is a writing practice that is very specific. And it's very different from practicing an instrument. In some ways, there's physical limitations, there's limitations of space, but I also find that when you speak to someone about a writing practice, it's much closer to talking to them about a composing practice in that I get up at 8, I go into this room, I do this until noon, and then I have lunch. And maybe that's different for members of Yarnwire where you do the same thing in practicing, but it would be interesting, just anybody that wants to jump in. I mean, I'm aiming this at Eric initially, but anybody that wants to jump in, because we're now also in different parts of our lives. I know some people are in a teaching thing now. Ian is teaching, and so that's a different schedule. People are moving around, they have kids. What role does that practice take for you now? What does it look like for you? Is it still very regimented like a writing practice? I guess to you, Eric, first. Or how has it changed as life has changed, or how has it changed in the last 6 months specifically, being such an odd situation?
Yeah, for me, it is very much that sort of practice. I think of myself as having like a writer's life in the way in which my day-to-day is kind of situated. And it is very much that. I work in the morning, I get up and have a certain time that I should be at the desk, and that's when I compose. And then I have other times of the day when I practice, and that's sort of in a specific zone. I think there are people that are more regimented than I am for sure, but I definitely am a schedule-based person and a habit-based person, treating that very much like a practice in that way. But I'm curious about others.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Anybody
I
else?
think I seek a habit-based lifestyle naturally. Rarely achieve that stability or like consistency in practice, but do find it really productive when I'm there. So, yeah.
Yeah, likewise. I mean, it would be nice. I would love to have the same kind of schedule that I used to have, maybe while studying and stuff like that. And like Ian said, when there's the opportunity for a schedule and be like, okay, this is going to be practice time, this is like this time, blah, 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 that is an ideal circumstance. But for myself, especially in the last 6 months, it's been very difficult to find that. I see it on the horizon. I don't know when. I think Dr. Fauci says in 2021.
Late
but
2021.
yeah, that's right. But yeah, right now it's kind of I have to kind of guard any time that I might have, and it's a luxury if I do have a little extra time to dig back into practice and stuff like that. But it is something that I find I flourish more when I have the headspace for that.
And maybe a more specific question to the Yarnwire people, because I've been talking with a lot of trumpet players about the difference in, our lives in that you're always just trying to get right before the next gig. You're trying to get the blood back so you can do what you need to do. And the amount of work that the four of you do, and the quick turnaround of pieces and the level that you have to perform, what's it like all of a sudden to be like vacuum? You know, is that a weird feeling? Is it a great feeling? Is it something that you're having a bit of a crisis over, or is it like, oh, thank God I can take a breath and play scales, you know?
I think at first it was, thank God I could just stop for a minute. It felt nice to like not feel that pressure of having, you know, the proverbial stack of things to learn or things to do or go over. But I think right now I feel the crisis, actually, because we talk about schedule-based and time-based and habit-based, and I feel like everything has become so shattered in how I operate and how I'm able to conceive of my day, even every day, that I still feel like I haven't been able to establish something new that works. And so it's like all of the things we're talking about to me feel like just this old memory of how things used to be. And I have to laugh because it's too dark otherwise.
Laura, I wonder, do you feel like rehearsals gave like a schedule or something? I'm like, that's like coming to my mind right now. It's like having a show, even if it's not like, you know, you don't have a show every week or something, right? But like when there's a show on the calendar, there's like a series of steps that you take to get to there, and that's like a semblance of a schedule. And right now, like, if something gets scheduled, you don't even know if that's going to come through.
Right.
And so like that solidity is kind of weird.
And I think it's like if I had that reality of being, you know, in my like hut in the woods, like I was at Banff so many years ago, where all I had to do was like play the piano and I didn't worry about disturbing anybody, and there was nobody trying to teach 4 hours of guitar lessons in the room next to mine that I'm disturbing. You know, I mean, those are the realities right now. So it's like those habit-based ways of existing, which I think would be ideal in my mind. They're just not possible. Everything is like what has to happen day to day, and there's not much space for what I want.
But Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3 p.m.
That's right.
Join us for something scheduled.
It's good to have structure. Do you want to say something?
No. I'm just saying I agree with everyone. The lack of structure these days is, you know, breaking me down.
Yeah.
The structure is daily, you know, every day is different.
Absolutely.
And so much time, yet no time. That is how I feel.
Yeah. Let's jump into alphabeta, because I want to make sure we have time to talk about the history of it, but also some of the things that struck me as I was listening to it in this last week. Kind of just to start, I would love to know the relationship between Eric and Yarnwire in a broad sense, because I think you do have history prior to this piece, and also what the very pragmatic reason for commissioning a piece from Eric was, and how that went down. So maybe someone from Yarnwire wants to do that.
Ian, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. I think this came out of 2009, 2010 commissioning project we internally called it Composing NYC. And I think we said that on the programs too. And this was the second of those. And it was on a concert that also featured music by Kate Soper, Sam Pluta, and Alex Minchek. And
what a presumptuous title! I'm sorry. I hear that title in like these days. I'm like, man, we really called it that. Sorry.
Oh, I know. It is hilarious.
It's like such a move.
but yeah, it was the idea was to work with the four kind of house composers of Wet Ink, which I'd been playing in for a while, and I think all the members of Yarnwire had been like friendly, you know, in the orbit of new music people in New York City. So that was the genesis of the collaboration.
And Eric, for you, what was the process like? Because in looking at pieces for an instrumentation like this, I stumbled across the Bartók piece for 2 pianos and percussion, and then either like got lazy or that was all that exists. But that's pretty much all I found. When you're coming into a piece like this where there's really no tradition, do you find that freeing, or was it difficult to conceive of? And what was your process like in just kind of doing the research to put the piece together?
Yeah, I do kind of like those. I kind of tend to steer clear of like the traditions or the genres that have like really, really deep traditions running, because I think that's just an intuitive choice that I like more of the sense that the parameters are a little bit more flexible. There's not a sense that whatever you do has to be seen in conversation with something from 2 centuries ago. And the piano and percussion world is definitely like that, the percussion repertoire in particular. So I think in approaching it, I didn't go back to the Bartók and study that piece or anything. I was really just approaching it like, what do I want to do within this space that's established by this instrumentation and with these people. And so I think, and any of you guys can correct me if you remember otherwise, but it just sort of started from kind of like really logistical, practical considerations of what gear do you have? And I remember there being a constraint about doing piano 4 hands instead of 2 percussion. And so that immediately has a different feel and a different kind of space. The ensemble has a different kind of size acoustically. And yeah, just then going through thinking about a kind of battery in the sense of a list of objects, physical objects of sounds that the percussionist would have. And very quickly from there, I think got to this idea that I would kind of try to, record each one of these instruments or sounds individually, and then run it through some software, look into it a little bit for trying to take what is a timbre or can be perceived as a timbre and try to look at it as a harmony, and kind of like melt it down a little bit from that into something that can then be used. Like I can put my hands on it a little bit more and like stretch it out into other types of material. So I remember going to the studio that several of you are in at the moment, and meeting with Ian and Russell, and just making a bunch of like iPhone recordings and whatever that was, 2010, and then going back and putting them through this software program called Spear that a colleague of mine at Columbia at the time had developed, which basically just like takes a snapshot of a sound in like a little window, kind of artificially, and then just does a very basic analysis of it and says these are some of the component frequencies in that. And it doesn't output it into notation, so you have to kind of go in there and like click on a little partial and like listen to it and like play it against the. So it's a very clunky, non like ear comm process with that stuff. But I like that. I like the obviousness with which you have to intervene and make it yours, because it's always there. But in this case, it's very clear. So yeah, I think that was just kind of the starting point. Was like building an overall sound world based on just these objects, and getting to trying to find ones that to me were kind of interesting, interesting sounds, interesting timbres, and interesting like whole range of kinds of things that when they all combined together, they would form this kind of overall field that was really interesting and could be rotated in all these different ways and filtered, and we could focus on this part of it and then this other part of it. And it was just kind of an interesting space when everything cohered together.
It's interesting that you say field, because I had just started listening to this after a rereading of the James Tenney essay about harmonic fields and expanding a harmonic field to include timbre and frequency and things like that. And so it had been on my mind, and there's this beautiful opening to the piece that if I had attempted it would have been ridiculous, but you handle it with such elegance, where essentially you lay out all the materials for the piece. And I think you even say in the directions to be played didactically or something like that. And it's an amazing thing. And I think we have a clip of it so people can watch and hear it. But it's so beautiful in the way that it lays out the harmonic field for the entire piece. And then in listening, you lose it and it comes back and it's always there. But to be presented with it, is really fascinating. And I also kept thinking about kind of the beauty of Alvin Lucier pieces where he tells you everything that's in it. And that is the piece, but it still is so interesting to listen to that just knowing what's there actually helps you out. There's no need for illusion. So I think maybe it would make sense before we move into other questions, because I do want to talk about the linguistic aspect of the piece, and talk to Yarnwire a little bit about like how do you put a piece like this together. If we listen to the opening of the piece, we have a clip from that, and this is just the portion where all the materials are laid out. The question that keeps coming to my mind for Yarnwire is the difference in a piece like this, where it's almost like there's a form of ventriloquism going on, you know, where the pianists are percussionists and vice versa. And at the end, Ning is both, in that she's playing castanets as well. What are the challenges of that? I mean, to me, the immediate thing that comes to mind is just the amount of precision you have to have as a group, because if anything is off, you lose that kind of magical timbral combination. Were there things that were particularly gnarly that you still have nightmares about this piece, or?
It taught us our sniff cues, I think.
Yeah, subdivided sniff cues.
Because it's early on, and like you're right. Like if you flam it, and there were so many flams, our flam jar is full of coins, and it's just it helped us along with that. And I still worry about those moments. Like, are we gonna play together or not?
Yeah. There's a lot of intense metronome practice, I remember, for lots of parts of this piece, just personally. I think that there is that section, which I'm sure we're going to talk about, the parlando section, which is all in rhythmic unison amongst the quartet. And it's like, it's not, now I would say it's not particularly difficult. I think when we first played the piece, playing, unison broken quintuplets, sorry if you're not a musician watching this, that's a little technical, but those rhythms were really tricky for us when we were starting out.
When you're putting this piece together, another thing that was of interest to me, Eric, and I think you already touched on it a little bit, I didn't know about your writing background before this, but was the use of linguistics as kind of a formal element of putting the piece together. Is something that I'm also interested in and coming from a different place. And so I started comparing some of the linguistic study that I had done through like Kenneth Gaburo and David Dunn and some of those composers to what you're doing, which to me sounds much more syntactical and poetic. And I was wondering if you could maybe just talk about the way that you created alphabets, or how you're conceiving of the three parts of the piece. and a little bit about where that comes from, and what was the impetus for you to transfer that knowledge onto a musical composition or a musical way of expressing it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't know that there's not a ton in the piece that it is like building on a kind of theoretical or like scientific, like particular tenets or anything, aside from just what I described in terms of, using software to look at timbre and to kind of like pull it apart a little bit. It's mostly metaphorical, but the strategy of trying to think of language and music as both meaningful expressions that are carried by sound, as a kind of metaphor of just bridging things, which is obviously a very old way of thinking about that. But I think, when I was thinking back on this piece recently, I think I can tie it back to an anecdote that I haven't ever really followed up on, but that stuck with me just forever, which is from a seminar at UCSD with Roger Reynolds in like the early 2000s, where he mentioned, I think it was a piece of Bill T. Jones, the choreographer, which did basically exactly this as a form. He just came out on stage and he said A, and then he like did a pose, and then he moved somewhere else and said B, and did another, or a move, then said C, did a third. And then after going through all of that, made a dance that was a concatenation of all of those different forms into strings and into different combinations, and building units from those initial sort of building blocks. And that was just, a big idea for me. And it recalled also a somewhat famous percussion piece by Vinko Globokar called Touché, which does a very, very similar thing. And I'm basically just like biting that at the beginning of this piece. But it's just, you're supposed to find a particular object that matches a speech sound. And you just say, this is the speech sound, this is the object. And the piece begins with that, and then you make music from it. But exactly as you're describing this, this idea that you could start a piece by saying, here it all is. I'm laying all of my cards on the table. I'm not hiding anything from you. I'm not smarter than you are. Here it is. And then still watch all the things that can happen from that. Like, everything, what I know. But here's now something that we can make with that. And isn't that also interesting, kind of fascinating, that like you have the knowledge to be able to see into any of these combinations that are being made by virtue of having been prompted with the sort of single versions of them, so that you can kind of pull them out when you hear them in combination. And yet, just the way in which hearing works, just the way in which music works, it's still fascinating or beautiful or interesting how those things can get kind of swept along into these contexts of sound. So the piece kind of builds things up, starting with that kind of opening like gambit of just, here's the stuff. And then it sort of builds up this language metaphor of first it's kind of like, it's like song, it's melodic. You take this thing that was timbre, that was all like locked together into these shapes of frequency, and it melts them down into something that can flow. So anytime they're in that section, someone's always rolling on an instrument. And as that happens, it's kind of projecting its timbre in this like sort of holographic field. Just that's what happens naturally. You roll on a drum and you get pitches, but you might not necessarily hear them as pitches unless there's something else in the context that's pointing you to hear them as pitches. And that's what the pianos are doing. They're playing melodies from that field as it's projected. It just touches that kind of scrim in various points. And that happens over and over again throughout that section. Then in the second part, we're just playing with speech rhythm and speech melody. And again, in a pretty intuitive way. I actually probably wrote out some like nonsense text and then just like tracked my voice and how I
I want to know what that text is.
I couldn't find it through my old notes. It's lost in the sands of time.
Yeah.
But I definitely remember, just thinking about, and have thought more and more about this as the years have gone on, about like speech as a kind of missing type in music. Like there's not, for me, there was always like, well, oh yeah, why haven't people done more things with music that not metaphorically, but really tries to replicate the speed and the rate of change of speech. And like, people have talked about how bebop is sort of connected to that. There's other types of music that have relationships to that rate of speed and that rate of like, how quickly the types of sounds that my vocal tract is generating right now, the rate of cycling between various kinds of noise sounds and harmonic sounds, like that speed as a musical type. So that's really interesting to me, because first of all, it's difficult to pull off. It's difficult for a single line instrument to pull off, so you need a kind of composite instrument. And so that's why you do that with sort of group texture, and that's why it's so difficult, because you have to get everyone to act as if they are a single thing, where everyone's contributing little elements of the components, and that's constantly in fluctuation. And yeah, so that's, but the video that you guys played, that I love how that middle section goes in that performance. It really works for me. And then the last section is just music. It's sort of like, let's take this metaphor to its kind of conclusion, and like, what if we just wiped away all that other stuff and just treated these sounds as like, let's just go. It's just pitches and rhythms and timbres.
Yeah. One of the things that keeps coming to my mind when you're talking is this concept that looks really sexy in an academic paper, but is very simple, and it's the idea of mapping. You know, we all map. We all take something that we find in the outside world and we put it into use in our daily life. You know, whether it's seeing someone jump on the back of the bus and not have to pay, we've mapped that experience onto our ability to not pay, like I didn't when I got on the bus today. But also, I think as artists, this idea of mapping is so deep and so ingrained in us that we don't always think about the process of it, what we go through to map. I mean, this is such a beautiful example of an explanation of how one maps outside experience into music. And the thing that I found really interesting, and we have a couple examples, but I don't think we'll play both of them. I think we'll just play the latter of the two, is to look at you as a composer versus some other composers that were mapping similar kinds of information in very different ways. And so it doesn't mean if I'm into this and I'm a composer, it's not an A to B causal relationship. It's an A to entire alphabet, you know, entire literature of the Western and Eastern world kind of situation. And one of the things that I don't think we'll play, but was fascinating, and I mentioned it earlier, is your use of linguistics or use of speech patterns and things like that is very different from Kenneth Gaburro's, where he really destroys speech. You know, it's not intended to not only not make sense, but to be recognizable as, even in some cases, phonemes. I mean, he breaks it down that far. But the thing that really struck me that I found fascinating, and I think it leads into our next part, which is where are you headed now, is the parts that felt most speech-like to me, where it felt most like you had mapped speech onto composition, also sounded the most like early 80s Cecil Taylor to me. And so I actually found a portion of the piece and then found an 80s, the beginning of an improvisation that I just wanted to play back to back. And not to say like this is coming from Cecil Taylor, but I think there's so much involved in what Cecil was doing with mapping poetry onto improvisation. And it's just two different versions of it that actually end up kind of sounding beautifully similar. So I thought it might be interesting just to check that out and then move into your practice now, which I know is including improvisation, and kind of take us out from there. So maybe we can play that bit, Rob. So it's not the same thing, obviously, but there are similarities in the speech-like phrasing to me that were just fascinating, because I feel like here's two people mapping a similar idea in very different ways, and both are beautiful and valid. And it takes me on to kind of the ending gambit of today's thing, which is, it's not only where you come from, but it's where you're going and where you can continue to go. And I wanted to read this partly because it comes from my publication, and I can use this whole day as like a tax write-off if I say it out loud. But also because this is a phrase from a conversation you had with Kate Soper in Sound American from last year, and there's these two paragraphs that I give to students to check out, because they're in the phase where they think that it's just enough to know how to technically play your instrument, at age 20. And this is just a way of kind of opening things up to them to show them what a life of making music is like. So I'm going to just read it, and I apologize for my reading, but this is what Eric says in Sound American 22. Quote, "A lot of what's really exciting to me musically is coming from improvisers more than new music composers. And as a result, I think I'm interested right now in openness and things that aren't 100% fixed, combining moments of rigor and of openness, and within the same space to create a more complex mode of listening, thinking of things from a slightly more zoomed out perspective where you're not really sure what is composed and sounds complex, or what sounds complex but is improvised. I think I just hit a moment where I realized that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life and career only doing the same things. And so I thought, what am I weak in? A kind of self-evaluation. I want to spend the next 10 years learning to be an improviser, finding ways to work with timbre that come out of electronic music, and integrating electronics in my music in more substantial ways. It's not that I'm rejecting all the musical language that I've built over the years, but I think it's good to have those moments of reflection. That's something I look for in the work of other artists as well, those big inflection points in their output." End quote. And that's not to say that, he's come over to improvisation, which is good. It's, to me, what that says is, here's a person that will never be bored. Here's a person that will always expand. And that's an incredible lesson. And, it comes out of this talk. It's kind of a simple transition to come from Cecil Taylor to that. But can you talk a little bit about where you are in that process? How are you feeling about it? Is it an easy thing for you? Is it still fulfilling? Or are you feeling like you're at a plateau? And I think this is a question actually for everybody in Yarnwire too, because I see it as much in your work as I do in Eric's. Hearing this recording from 10 years ago, and then being involved with you at the Miller Theater thing, and hearing what I know to be a very different, very collaborative, very spontaneous piece with Anea Lockwood, shows this similar kind of expansion. So maybe we can start with Eric and then go on to members of Yarnwire that may also want to talk about that.
Yeah. Well, I think this process started, as you mentioned, for me a little bit earlier, but obviously we've hit a massive inflection point as a nation, as a world, in a lot of ways. So I think you get a little bit of not validation, but it speaks to that same situation when you have this feeling of course, we're not going to just be able to do the same things forever and expect to get the same result. Also, I think I've spent a lot of time recently, since I moved back to New York in 2016, just being around more and more people who were engaged deeply and seriously in a lifelong way in the practice of improvisation, and that they all shared this commitment to practicing, to like lifelong study, to just the dedication and commitment that they brought to the way in which they viewed themselves as musicians was something that I was just like, yes, that exactly. That's what it's about. So I think part of it has been a process of identifying with that set of values that I see as a very prominent thing in that in the among people that I really respect in that world. It's also present in the people that I love and respect in the new music community who are committed to that and who are at the top of their game, and who are all extraordinarily creative, committed, dedicated people. So that's what I want for all of us. And for me at this moment, what that has meant is just trying to, it really does feel like race against time with just like your personality and what you've been. It starts to fix after a certain point, and it really feels like, okay, I need to do this before it's too late. I need to embark on whatever growing I'm going to do. That's like big picture growth. Really needs to get started now, and it's not going to happen quickly with something that's as infinite a practice as improvisation, and something that involves so much new breaking open of entirely new sets of skills and ways of being for me, I think. So I am a beginner at that, and I practice that, and I don't do it much in public, but I'll start doing it more whenever that can happen again. But I do it in solo at home. I listen to things. I think about it in systematic ways and in creative, non-systematic ways. And it's something that I'm trying to figure out my personal relationship to. I'm not, trying to become an improviser all of a sudden. That is like, that's what I do. I'm leaving this stuff behind. It's definitely not that. I'm interested in wholeness. I'm interested in integration. I'm interested in synthesis, in a personal version of what the music that I've done that is in some ways so specific and detailed and about structure, how that can just be enriched and enlivened and split open by the idea that not everything has to be fixed, and you can just deal with all of these other things that can just feel so differently against something that is really fixed. There's just a whole universe of expressive possibilities, I think, in the combination of those kinds of things. But it's also a situation where, like, for those of us that are composer performers, we're thinking about the politics and the relationships that go into the composer performer relationship, and how hierarchy and all these sorts of things that can be real problems. So it's the same with improvisation. If I, as a composer, am all of a sudden just gonna be like, now you improvise. Now there's something that's kind of bullshit about that too. So like, I need to be able to address that from the inside, from a first person perspective, in order to like ethically, legitimately inhabit that space with other people who are, expert and master in that practice. So I'm a beginner. I'm working on it, and I'm really interested to see where it goes.
How about Yarnwire? For I'm keeping an eye on the time, so we only have a couple minutes. But what's kind of next for you? What's the thinking right now? I know there's difficulties, but if we're just speaking in a utopian artistic world, where would you like to head as a quartet from now? What kind of music would you like to make? What kind of expansion are you interested in?
Well, I don't know if this is again. I don't want to speak for everybody or speak in universal.
Right. It's a little.
For sure.
It's difficult for me to give you such a question that one person's expected to answer.
But I think, I don't know. Listening to Eric talk about this, I feel like because we're friends outside of a professional context, and I think one of the reasons that we are both friends and both colleagues who tend to work together is because I really personally agree with a lot of the things that Eric says, and I think all of us have that same sort of searching desire to continually grow as musicians. I think none of us want to just lock ourselves into the same types of artistic practices that we have done in the past. And I don't know if it's appropriate to say this, but it's, actually also making me really excited that hopefully we'll get to work on a new piece with Eric at some point in the future. So I think that'll be really interesting to see the ways that both we have grown as an ensemble and the way that he's grown as a composer and musician too.
That's great. I'm just kind of I'm keeping an eye on the time, and I want to be respectful of all of your time, and also the people that are tuning in on a Tuesday at 3. So I think we should wrap it up unless someone has anything they'd really specifically like to say. If not,
I'll add something. So to this, what Laura just said, I mean, I personally also really looking forward to another opportunity to work with Eric and seeing Eric's piece. After that performance, it really just invigorates me, to listen to that piece and seeing us being together in the same physical space is really exciting, and I think that is the main goal. And I feel like in generally, especially with what's going on in our country, especially just in terms of social justice, I think we as a group, going forward, commissioning and working with different organizations and just keeping in mind of who we work with and whose music we are really focusing our energy on, and then sort of reaching out to as wide of audience as we really could, to to really to not be selective of where we play and be at service as a musician in as many communities as we can. So that's what I wanted to add. So yeah, thank you so much, Eric and Nate, for joining us. This was wonderful. And thanks so much for all of you watching. Thanks for joining us today. And I would let you know that on September 17th, we have a talk with Ty Braxton and Ben Vida. Please remember to subscribe to our channel and check out our page on patreon.com. And that's a place where you can support this project in exchange for exclusive subscriber benefits. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.
Yeah.